a little bit shorter, and they will be accompanied with the biscuits. If you like some biscuits, or if you don't like some, just let me know. We can keep buying those which you like. And there will be some seminars when some invited speakers will be coming, and those will be with pizza. So for now, the list of the seminars hangs actually on the web pages of the Department of Zoology with the details. And there are also like, I will try to be sending the emails always in advance on Sunday or on Monday. So you should know whether there will be pizza or not, or whether there will be only the cookies. And for the first volunteer from within the laboratories, it was Petr Klimes who volunteered. So the floor is his for today.
Oh, thank you, Katka. Yeah, so I hope we will keep even better audience next time. I'm not sure if you have speaker for next time already, so
Yes,
please register. Okay, great. And today I will just tell you some shorter talk about like variance in community composition or structure, and also nutrient use by ants in tropical high mountains, which we did in colleagues in past years. And I presented that in Prague conference of biogeography, where was almost nobody from Budějovice, so I guess you will not mind to have this talk. I just make it like a little bit more detailed, just than the usual conference presentation was still not too long, so it's fine. So for introduction about elevational gradients and why we are interested in them. So what's interesting about high, especially tropical mountains, is that they kind of mimic a latitudinal gradient of diversity, because you can have like tropical environment in the lowland, which is changing to deciduous forest in the high altitude, and some pastures and alpine zones, even near equator. And of course, this distinction is highest in the tropics, but rather low where is already cold environment in the lowland. Which also means that most of the changes in invertebrate abundance and biodiversity, but not only insects, but also plants and vertebrates, happens along these really huge tropical mountains. One of the taxon we are interested in our department, and especially in my laboratory, are some social insects, ants and termites. This will be about ants, which I am expert on. And why we are interested in them is that recent estimates say that they make actually quite significant part of biomass of invertebrates on the earth. And they are also quite sensitive to temperature, even more sensitive than some other insects, because they make colonies. So actually to survive in climate, the queen has to establish colony and collaborate with workers on the brood development and so on. So they, as a social insects, are quite sensitive to temperature changes. And they are also interesting from functional perspective, because they are, especially in tropics, so we can divide them to some more special groups like predators, scavengers and omnivores, or some species which are more dependent on plant resources. So either directly, like Nectaria, as you can see on the picture of Philip Henle, who made these nice photos in Papua New Guinea, actually, or also on honeydew from some homopteran insects, for example. And these changes of abundance and composition are actually quite high along tropical gradient, because as I already explained it, for example, this is some schematic of Mont-Wilhelm gradient, where we studied these elevations 500 meters apart in Mont-Wilhelm, and you have quite different communities here and upwards where are called specialists. And also the unspecies richness, but also the abundance of ants is quite abruptly changing to higher elevation, with some slight low elevation mid-peak about 900 meters, which is also quite common pattern in some other tropical mountains. But what has been shown by Marcel Peters in Kilimanjaro was also this interesting proportional change, where if you divide ants to the guilds, which I mentioned here on the photos, you have actually proportional increase of predators and scavengers with elevation, while the other functional groups, especially those who are tending trophobionts or visiting nectarias, are actually vanishing rapidly with elevation. And this actually led our colleague Marcel Peters to some hypotheses. that community structural changes of ants with elevation could actually translate to some predictable nutrient use patterns, because perhaps because the scavengers are increasing with elevation, that's why also ants are preferring more lipids and some amino acids in the higher altitudes, while maybe the honeydew eaters like more sugars in the lowlands. But it was hypothesized actually not on some statistical tests, but just this like kind of visual correlation in that study. But if you come to assumption from literature, there is this like nutrient limitation hypothesis, which actually says that the organism is in the highest demand of the nutrient, which is limiting in the environment or lacking in the diet. So it could be also like actually opposite, like the ants who have a lot of lipids from prey, they might like sugars in higher altitudes just because they don't have them and they need them as a fuel, for example. So it can get also opposite direction to this kind of specialization pattern where you would just predict what the specialist insect eats, it will prefer. With ants, it's more complex because they are quite omnivorous. Even within some of these guilds, they can still accept other foods. And based on this assumption, from some other studies, there was not much done really apart of this Mount Kilimanjaro study before on nutrient use, but a lot of studies used actually some nutrients like lipids, salt, or sugars to try out what nutrients ants prefer in different environments. And from that, we would have some assumptions like carbohydrates, sodium, and amino acids should be maybe more consumed in lower elevations and in the drier season to compensate for some higher metabolic rates which you have in the hot environment and dry environment, while lipids could be more used in higher elevations and wet seasons because the insects have like higher, like they need more like a long-term energy storage. Like this is more known actually from mammals who save lipids for winter time, but maybe it could work for some insects as well. And there could be also some prediction for these different trophic guilds, as I mentioned before, which might like suggest that predators might be more limited by carbohydrates and lipids. Because they need this rapid energy, but also they don't have so many carbohydrates in the food, while herbivores maybe were already shown before, even like caterpillars or foliage-eating herbivores, that they are limited by some sodium or protein compounds in the diet, which might be the same for ants. So we were doing this like wider study which was done with colleagues by several teams, which was published last year in Global Ecology and Biogeography, where we were looking this like to a bit wider perspective, actually trying to answer this question if there is this like predictable structure of ants with elevation and if it translates to some predictable common nutrient use as this hypothesis would suggest. And this was done by 3 teams in the field. So I was actually not myself doing field sampling, but it was Jimmy Moses, who is now in PNG University teaching statistics. Within his PhD, who was doing experiment in Woodville, and then Marcel Peters, who already published dataset before in Kilimanjaro, and Yvonne Tide, also PhD student. She was working with Nina Farvik from Marburg University. And then some other colleagues, especially former our student Ondra Motl, helped with some statistical modeling and other people with identification of ants like David Donoso or with like senior kind of supervision of the project. And the initial idea of this nutrient used by ants was actually quite a while ago introduced by Nate Sanders, who sometimes calls this protocol as an ant picnic because the ants are like kind of going to picnic when we put the base and they use the nutrients. This is the areas of the 3 mountains. So as you can see from this map from Rahbeck study on the background, which is basically showing where is the highest species richness globally. You can see that these mountains were not only very high, like going from lowland up to the forest line, where we sample the ants, but they are also in the really highest diversity hotspots in different continents, actually. The protocol of this ant picnic is basically that you place on the ground this 50 milliliter tube, which some people know very well from laboratory, and we put like cotton ball soaked with some nutrient. It's basically 20% solution in water of glutamine, amino acid, sucrose, then a mixture of the sucrose and amino acid, which is kind of honeydew dummy. It's very simplified because to do such experiments, you need to use exactly the same nutrient. So your foods are not influenced that you bought some, like a cocktail of proteins, for example, in PNG and in nootropics. So that's why we use just the glutamine and sucrose. Then olive oil for standardization and salt, and then put water, of course, 100% water in this case, which was supposed to be kind of control of the experiment, but because we were looking also seasonality, we actually use it as a nutrient because there are a lot of studies shown that water use is also nutrient for organism, and consumption can, of course, differ between dry and wet season. So we still analyze this data as well. And each site was sampled repeatedly in dry and wet season by a simple transect of these baits, where you put them in a random order, just pulling them from the bag, and then later you take note which nutrient was it. So it's actually five replicates per site of each of these nutrients. Here you can see Jimmy, how he's sampling in Mont Wilhelm, putting the base with assistance, and then the bait is visited by ants, and you basically close it and kill the ants and count them later, which ant species and in what quantities were coming inside of the tube. This is Yvonne from Ecuadorian gradient in Cordilleras, which she says this was carrying the base. So even though that the replication was not super high per transect, it's quite a lot of work to carry so much food for ants to the top of the mountain. And you need some assistants and other students to actually do such experiments. And then what we did in terms of modeling was basically that we used like each site as a replicate. We were not looking like individual base, but actually a whole site. And we basically assume abundances and like occurrences, abundances and species richness across these bays or across a nutrient, looking some general patterns in species richness and activity. Here, activity means simply the occurrences of ants. So, and we modeled like interaction of elevation, region, and season. And then we were specifically looking also the effects of elevation and season on the relative nutrient used by ants. So this is done on individual nutrients after just simply modeling the interaction of season and elevation in each region separately. And then we were also looking, is this trophic gills, which I showed at the beginning, is it really correlated, or does it really have some explanatory power to explain the patterns which we see in the nutrient use? So basically, first is just looking at the species richness and occurrence. Occurrence was kind of similar to abundance. And what you can see, it's not so easy to compare these gradients, because even though that this is one of the last 3 mountains which have still pristine forest, because this was all done in primary forests, the elevations are not completely comparable, because the Papua New Guinea is the only one where you can go from lowland upwards really through the forest. While in Ecuador and Tanzania, the tree line is like lower or hardly accessible, and in lowlands, either Ecuador is already too high or Tanzania is destroyed by plantations. So you cannot actually do like a perfect comparison. So that's why you have also these lines for common elevation range. And one thing, there are basically 2 most interesting things. Like one is that actually, especially for species richness, the speed, how species richness relatively decrease for this dash line band is almost equal for all 3 mountains. So it's quite comparable. But what is different is seasonal effect. So we were kind of surprised to see that there is not so much seasonal effect in Tanzania. Quite a lot of seasonal effects in Ecuador, where you have more ants, especially in lowlands in dry season. But in PNG, it's actually opposite, which we didn't expect. So we got quite strong interactional effect between season and between the elevation. And then, yeah, like this, I think is interesting. The interactional effect and the similar speed of decline of richness. But then, of course, the diversity of ants, for example, in Tanzania is lower than Ecuador because nootropics is crazily rich. So it's like a relative decrease. It's not the absolute diversity, which was also different between the mountains. If you look at the nutrients, you can first like ignore elevation for simplicity, as some other studies did, and look only proportional occupancy of beds. And from that, we got some common like pattern across all mountains that everywhere on average, lipids and carbohydrates were the most preferred nutrients, and the others like much less. But once you look at also some variance between the regions and especially between seasons, you start to see actually quite big differences. That's why there is this interactional effect on simple proportion occupancy per site, ignoring elevation quite significant. But it already could be kind of guessed because if there is this big seasonal effect, it must translate somehow also to the nutrients. Probably the biggest difference is, for example, amino acid, which is crazily preferred in wet season in PNG, but in dry season in Ecuador. Then we were looking at the individual nutrients. So this is actually not so easy to do, and we can discuss maybe later if this is good method or not. But what you need to do for this relative comparison is somehow to be interested in season and elevation, but at the same time a little bit standardized per elevation. Because if you would put the elevation as an effect as here, you will have basically always a decreased use of nutrients because there are almost no ants here. So it will be always decreasing and it will be difficult to tell the differences apart. So that's why Marcel actually advised us to standardize, as in his study, that you use some like complicated relative index, which is weighted by occurrences in each site and preferred nutrient. So the curves are kind of meaningful, and you don't get just like some complete random data or decrease with elevation. But still, even after this correction, the patterns were not so strong. So we were very surprised to see that you have this like how many, like 18 combinations, and with 18 combinations we have almost not single one which will be common. So just by random, somebody could tell maybe this is a random pattern. We still try to do some fades, and for some of them they were statistically significant, some were like marginally significant. But basically, if you have horizontal line, it's only seasonal effect. If you have seasonal lines which are like banded, it's like season plus elevation, and if they are crossing, it's like interactional effect, which was actually happening only here for sugars in Ecuador, which decline in dry season with elevation, but not at all in wet season, and that's a quite significant trend. But basically, the main conclusion was there is no common use of nutrients by ants, at least from these experiments, and also a part of Tanzania where the effect of seasonality was low, but we have also fewer data points. The season is actually the main driver. That's what is like most interesting. The elevation, not so much, maybe except of some decrease of sugar use and lipids in Ecuador. Then they come actually another surprise, because once you divide the ants to guilds, the patterns are super consistent. And based on this, we didn't expect it so much to be consistent. And it was so consistent that even the decrease of generalis ants in dry season was consistent, which goes against this like seasonal pattern. So to the guilds, it was like super consistent. There was not even some seasonal change, which would be different between regions. I have to admit, this is still kind of like a not perfect analysis, because for tropical species, we don't know exactly what's the definition to guilds. So it's done kind of blindly based on literature and stable isotope, what is published. If you don't know the species, what it is, you just do it per genus. So it's like a little bit taxonomically correlated, but still we were surprised by this consistency. There were a little bit differences, but not so much. But once we try to correlate this, like simply asking like if the sites which have the highest proportion of a guild explain the nutrient use, if the sites where the predators are dominating, for example, are explaining that the lipids were used in high elevations in Ecuador, for example, there was almost no effects. It was super low R square, and except like few cases there was some like barely significant result, and typically only for some super rare ant guild, not like a dominant one, we didn't get any effects. So basically the conclusion would be that this hypothesis of Marcel was like not correct, and the ants use nutrient differently, but it's completely like irrelevant how if there are special predators, omnivores, or whatever. So now I would like to just summarize how to make like a story from it, because it was not so easy as you could see, because the patterns are going kind of more random and against the theories and so on. So I was looking at the literature, and the conclusion would be that we have very similar changes with elevation and activity in ants, but there is this different seasonal effect, which is quite interesting, consistent, and actually there are not many studies which would compare. Well, there are basically no studies from different regions which would compare elevational patterns in ants as such between tropical mountains. So even that it's novel and it's very consistent, that's good. But there is this inconsistent activity across season and also inconsistent individual nutrient use by ants, which probably partly is explained by this seasonal like variance. So we were first thinking like maybe this nutrient limitation hypothesis doesn't have sense. But then when I was looking at the literature, maybe this nutrient limitation may still drive ant activity, and then also nutrient use changes between seasons, at least a little bit. So because there is no single study, but if you look some old and newer literature, including some studies of us from Papua New Guinea, in neotropics, what is very common pattern is that with like higher rainfall, you have also a lot of insects. So actually the availability of food, at least for scavengers and predators, and maybe even the plant resources should be higher. There are also studies that the plants are more flowering in wet season in neotropics. So if the ants are less active in dry season, it could be that they basically like are like not having like so much food, right? But in the like PNG, it's actually opposite. So there is this Katka study which showed that if you go to transition to wet season, you have actually like less insects. So it's opposite to neotropics. And from our felling study in Banang, this was even more visible. So we basically like fell the forest through the year, whole hectare, and you have many more caterpillars collected per foliage in the summer, like in May to July when we sampled our PNG dry season. So it's exactly opposite to neotropics. So it might also explain this like varying pattern in ant activity. And in Tanzania, we didn't have so many data points, but there are data from Nature paper by Marcel Peters published before, which we tried to use. And we actually found out if you put like insect abundances with elevation, the seasonal difference is not so big. So that might explain why we also don't have so many like seasonal differences here. But as I say, the data points are not so perfect. The study could be more data points. So it might make some sense. Maybe there's just like simply many more food for ants in different season, and nutrient limitation might still like drive it a little bit. But there are still some other limitations. So one limitation we faced with such a like a large comparative study was what I was just seeking here. There's basically no background food availability data for ants. And we have no such data which would be measured exactly in time of our experiment, because this is very difficult to do. Basically, it's quite simple to put the baits, but if you would like to have background ant data of the prey, you would need to sample all insects in the forest, all nectaries, all aphids, and some other stuff, and that's very difficult to do. While a rapid experiment with baits is quick, so that's why people use it as a dummy experiment. Then another limitation is interannual variability. Like with referees, we were like a little bit criticized, like, okay, it's nice that you have these 3 regions. It's the first time you did the seasonality, but it's only 1 year. So maybe this randomization across seasons is just random. There is another study showing that it shouldn't be so random, but now Brazilians actually publish ecography paper where they did show the gradient, but they look over 10 years. Over 10 years, they sampled insects each year, and actually the fluctuation between years for insects and elevation patterns, it's quite random and quite dodgy. So we cannot exclude completely that this variance across seasons might be actually variable between years. And we also didn't measure ant activity and composition separately of the baits. So somebody can argue this is circular because you are looking only what is coming to baits. But we kind of assume that what is coming to base is representative, which agrees with our other data from Mount Wilhelm, but still from other mountains, we don't have this background data. So that could be another critical point. And there was also a recent study which showed like in ecology from Brazil, actually still very strong like guilt effect. So they basically show that the arboreal ants, which are like mostly sugar eaters or omnivores, they really go crazily for sugars, while the predators, they or subterranean ants, they go for more for lipids across some sides. Not always. There was like one side which was going opposite, but it looked quite consistent. But problem is that this is not like comparative to our study, because these studies are looking only lowlands and they are looking the gills, which we don't do because we sample just the ground. So we were just like here, right? So it's kind of still difficult to make this conclusion because they don't sample the gradients and they look the multiple gills by stratum, by the habitat, which probably still plays a big role. Yeah, so you have a lot of puzzling and different results across studies, but you have to think also of methodology. So that's it. Yeah, sure.
Can I ask, you have kind of bitten into it a little bit, but let's say you have a lot of ground-dwelling ants that you sampled, and is it possible that since, you know, ants are probably less guild restricted when it comes to feeding habits, which means, you know, even ants that you would classify as scavengers are kind of omnivorous, is it possible that simply when something's on the ground, they just go for it, and if where there are differences, they are not strong enough to denote, you know, guild specific feeding requirements when you focus on the ground-dwelling ants? How specific is the guild decomposition into of you know ants as well?
Yeah, I mean this compositional guild definition, I admit it's still quite dodgy. I try my best, like using some picture.
It's probably correct since you know that is
but obviously, like you know, like there was, for example, like first we get different patterns for Ecuador, and then I was kind of suspicious looking one common species and asking expert, and he was like, yeah, in the literature it's omnivores, but look at the mandibles, how it look like, it's specialist predator. So then you change just one common ant to predator, and the patterns look more clear. So that was like only correction we actually make, but it's still kind of blind analysis because you don't know for sure. But the problem with this like specificity question, I mean, definitely there is like less specialized ants between different guilds on the ground because these omnivores and terrestrial predators will be like more present. So that's why maybe this other study was getting more clear results when they sampled by strata. But also to answer your question, the best would be looking at the same species, and if it keeps the same preference across different elevations, or what does it do? But this is super difficult to do because basically most of the ants they are not present in more than 1-2 elevations. So we tried to look at that, but it was not possible. So
maybe it would work if you
but still, you know, like in general, the composition structure of ants is probably very similar across the regions. We also didn't have so many army ants coming to the bait, so it was kind of, you know, in all mountains it was 50% Phaedulae and some ants which are even as a genus common across regions. So there was not a single species common, but the genera were common, and I would still argue, like, if you get such different pattern between here and here or whatever, that it's probably what the ants like to have the nutrient, what they are limited to, or what they, because if they wouldn't like the bait, if the food would be the nutrient not good to collect, they wouldn't come, they wouldn't accumulate in the bait. So it should still reflect the preferences, but there is a lot of possible randomness as well, like who comes first, who is dominating the bait, and which is not possible to really disentangle with the larger scope study.
Maybe a bit general question, but I was wondering about this difference of arthropod abundance between Ecuador and Papua New Guinea, like the trend. Like, how do you explain that in PNG you get like more abundant? Like, do you have
I
some
mean-
explanation for that? Or?
Yeah, I was first thinking that maybe, you know, I was checking carefully, like this is switched, right? So I was checking like, does it really make sense? Like that, what I call like wet and dry season. So I look at the Katka paper, then I found out in one paper for same period, you say dry, the other wet, and it's kind of confusing because mostly people look like that, like transition time. So they look like end of dry, beginning of wet, and but I think I made still the division correct because I was cross-checking with some better data from Maurice Lebons and that augurs, and because we sampled dry in like May, June, and wet in October, November, the October, November should be wetter. But it's not like a perfect distinction. More perfect would be like coming in Christmas time where it's just crazy rain. But that's not possible for us because they wouldn't come through baits in rain. So you have to wait even in the rain time, you have to wait for day without big rain to actually sample them. So I think it's correct pattern, but the explanation I don't have it. It's actually quite surprising because we actually predicted based on literature and temperature differences and rain differences between dry and wet, the seasonality being highest here because Tanzania is the most seasonal mountain and the points are fewer, but still it was not there. So, and then what's interesting, if you look at Queensland studies and Australia studies, they have the same pattern as PNG. But it can be explained more just by temperature because it's like how is it dry, colder winter in Australasia. So basically that you have much less ants. So in some South Australia mountains in dry season is to be expected because it's like their winter. But in PNG the temperature is more stable through here, but it replicates the same pattern as Australia. So I don't know why, but
I'm just wondering because, like, of course, you characterize dry and wet season by the rainfall, but like when you see the difference between Ecuador and Papua New Guinea, you always have this switch between the dry and wet, and maybe it's more correlated to the abundance of arthropods, where you have like the more food limitation, like the trend limitation.
yeah, I mean that was like because it's even like opposite, like the ants go opposite. So we have more ants in dry season in Ecuador, but there is more insects and more flowering happening in wet season. And the PNG is opposite. So that's why I think maybe nutrient limitation is still the explanation. Because the ants are actually going more for baits and nutrients, but there is less insects and less food in the forest. So that was kind of my main interpretation, but it's not so easy to see. So maybe in Australasia, the plants are more flowering in drier time or beginning of dry season. I don't know, maybe this thing is shifted, but it was kind of difficult for me to find it in literature.
If I can add
Yeah.
to this, like when we have the baits, like for the predation, they indeed all our experiments follow the opposite pattern of the density of the arthropod. So of course, when we put the standardized amount of baits everywhere, they attack them more in the places where there is not enough insect or like there is
Yeah.
lower amount of insect.
In your
which really
experiments?
doesn't work
Okay,
well.
yeah.
And to make the things even more trickier, we now collected the things along the vertical gradient to along the crane across the season, beginning of the dry season, beginning of the wet season, and end of the wet season. And the patterns go opposite. Like there is a high diversity of ants in the canopy at the beginning of the season, but the other insects are not there. So the seasonal pattern goes like
Okay.
in
Yeah,
the
interesting, yeah.
exact opposite pattern.
But in general, it looks like it could go with this nutrient limitation, which is actually quite nice because it's not like that there is more insects, there is more ants, that it will be just some simple temperature cryptic effect or something. It's something more. It's maybe some avoidance of the insects in time and some competition, predation, nutrient limitation going on. Yeah, that's interesting. I think vertically that's even nobody knows, so your experiments will be probably the very important primary.
In journal. Wait,
Oh shit, okay. Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, okay. It's not so simple. I mean, you know, I publish in Better Journal, but still nobody cites it. So maybe once it's too complex, nobody cares. They like
Exactly.
researchers like more the single simple, easy hypothesis. So
You planning collecting throughout multiple years? I know it's not very. Then like the likely outcome is that you'll get some mass and then we'll publish again in some journal. But like, are you planning something like that? Or?
no, I think this was already so. I mean, it was crazy effort because you know, the standardization of protocol was not so perfect as I would like to. I don't think it really influenced these patterns much, but we have to be careful discussing. Each of the mountain was done also in different year, of course, because it was like various experiments, and to do it like simultaneously, like multiple years, you would be probably ERC grant and then publish the journal of tropical ecology. I don't know. Yeah, it's like, yeah, but there is like there was one study from South Australia by Tom Bishop where they have this like long-term series of ants from pitfall traps, but it's more seasonal mountain. But they show there is fluctuation, but the general difference is still always there, like higher, lower, wet, dry. But it's more seasonal. Like this recent Brazilian one, which is just like really like Brazil, they have more random fluctuation. So yeah. So yeah, we have to be a bit careful, but from what Katka also says and some literature, it looks these patterns might be, at least this bigger seasonal differences might be like likely to repeat unless you have El Nino maybe.
Okay, but we have nearly.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.